where there was this accidental chain split because there was a network upgrade. There was an incompatibility between the old version of the software, the new version, and people didn't like that. And they said, well, let's just roll it back. And they did, So Bitcoin, we said it's a mutable, decentralized ledger, was rolled back and completely reversed the state of the ledger.
Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Hello, Jack. How are you doing this fine evening?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Alec. I notice we're both in our Jedi and Padawan outfits tonight. In the spirit of Ahsoka airing at the minute. Yeah, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's obviously winter now. It's getting cold, so we started wearing hoodies rather than paying the bills. It's more like Jedi and Sith. I think you're looking a bit evil, to be honest.
You should have said hello there at the start, and that would have been much funnier.
Such a terrible reference, but I love it. So today's episode is an interesting one. I can see Jack smiling because he's super excited to talk about this one. Today we're talking about another controversial topic, decentralization.
Yeah, this is I think it's really interesting, actually, and it is a bit controversial because, again, lots of different opinions on it. But that's why I'm glad we're covering it. I think we'll be able to tease out a bit of a definition and explain the various viewpoints on it. So I mean, maybe I should go first this time because I always put you on the spot, Alec, and try and explain what decentralization is. So for me, it's quite simple, actually. If something is decentralized, then you normally use the term to describe a system. So like something like Bitcoin or a blockchain is a system. It has rules and participants in it. And decentralization is the quality of a system that it doesn't have a central point of failure. And to me, that's pretty much the main definition you should use for this term.
Yeah, I think it's nice and concise and simple. Are you telling me that decentralization isn't about anarchism and, anti-elite and anti-government, all this kind of stuff? I feel like that's what you're alluding to. But no, I'm being facetious. Jack's right. Decentralization, I think, is kind of misused in a lot of this space. And I think the word really is more of in my mind anyway, the way I use it is from the technical kind of perspective. And if we're thinking about how decentralization applies to blockchains or cryptocurrencies was the last episode we did, how it applies to that, it's all about distributing the ledger which is we can describe it as that Excel sheet that stores all the transactions, having multiple copies of that Excel sheet or that ledger at different points, and different people, different entities, different nodes, PCs, whatever you want to call them. And that effectively means resilience, right? So when Jack talks about single points of failure, if I just have one version of my Excel sheet and all of a sudden my computer goes down and gets wiped, that Excel sheet's gone forever. But if I have 10 versions of that Excel sheet, all with the exact same copy, all live, all working together to make sure they're running the exact same Excel sheet, and one of them goes down, well, that's fine. I've got 9 backups, so there's no single point of failure. And that's what Jack is trying to talk or get across when he says single point of failure, right, Jack?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really interesting that you use the word distributed there as well, because there's a very fine distinction between decentralization and distribution, or something that's decentralized versus just distributed, because I think we tend to use the word decentralized in the context of kind of open, permissionless systems like blockchains, where you have people can come and leave, and it's an open protocol. And decentralization, because there are different flavors of decentralization actually as well, we'll come on to, but really the meaningful sense is kind of decentralization of power. So who has the power to update the blockchain, for example, who has power to change the system. And this, if something is distributed, it's more tends to mean in the flavor of it's like a distribution of resources, having backups, the local copies. And Bitcoin does a bit of this both, but you can have a distributed system that is centralized from a power perspective. Like if you think of something like Facebook or Twitter or Amazon, they are operating massive distributed systems because they have servers and data centers across the world, which are kind of keeping local backups and things. So decentralization for me is much more apt in an open blockchain type context.
Got you. So, like, my understanding of the white paper, which is obviously the Bitcoin white paper, is that it actually doesn't use the term decentralization, right? But it does use the term distributed. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, it's an interesting observation,
Don't
right? Because
pretend like you don't know it word for word. Like, pretend you think so. It's on his wall somewhere, I think.
yeah. Well, I have to be coy about these things, but yeah, I do know it pretty well. It talks about the word honest much more than it talks about anything like decentralization. And actually, that's an interesting point. Is that a lot of people, when they talk about Bitcoin and similar blockchain systems, I've often heard people say the whole point of Bitcoin is decentralization. They say it's the end, right? Or this, they might sometimes just say it's the means to the end as well. But they say that's the core point of it. And I have always thought of decentralization as more of an emergent property. So Bitcoin has this design that enables peer-to-peer electronic cash, and as a result of how it's designed, it is always decentralized in the power sense. It's not like, oh, it must be decentralized and that's the end goal. No, it's the end goal is digital cash, and as a result of doing that properly, it ends up having to be decentralized.
Well, this is something I actually do want to talk about in more detail. So you're saying that Bitcoin has to be decentralized. I think when you talk about the kind of the power in, say, a blockchain network or Bitcoin or any of these cryptocurrencies we tend to talk about, power. People think that the power is decentralized and all the people are contributing to the network. If you own a Bitcoin, then you are part of the power dynamic that runs the Bitcoin network, right? And then what was that thing about Raspberry Pis? You can mine with the Raspberry Pi and you can contribute to the network. But this isn't true, is my understanding. It's actually the miners who control the network, right? They are effectively the people in power. And when everyone says, if you've got any Bitcoin or you're running a Raspberry Pi and you're contributing to the BTC network, that's not in fact true. It's the miners, and it's far more centralized than people think. If you've got 10,000, nodes on BTC or whatever it is, really all the mining power, that's actually the network administrators who are contributing to that ledger. We can think about the miners as being the people that actually own the Excel files and are appending to the Excel files to update the ledger and contribute to the ledger using proof of work. They're actually the people with the power. So it's far less decentralized than people tend to think.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where that kind of main controversy comes in, is people will sometimes define decentralization of a blockchain as the number of people who are effectively using the node software, who are running software that interacts with the blockchain essentially and can validate the blockchain. But really, and the opposite view that I subscribe to is that, as you said, the only people that really matter in terms of the upkeep of Bitcoin, upkeep of the ledger, are the miners, the ones who are expending energy, proof of work. They're kind of putting, they've got skin in the game for the maintenance of the ledger under the rules. So some people will say, the metric that is important for decentralization is the number of people who run node software. Whereas I think it's very much, it's just the number of nodes that are actually creating blocks, who are exerting proof of work. And one of the arguments, because I really can't buy the first argument about the people just running the node software, and people will say, oh well, we're still involved, we're still important to the system, even if I run this software on a Raspberry Pi, a really low powered kind of device that's not doing proof of work. They'll say it's still important because I can validate the blockchain, I can check that everything's correct. And then the question I always have is, okay, well, if something isn't correct, what can you do about it, right? Because if you're not producing blocks, you can't affect the system. And that's why decentralization only really applies to the node network, the miners themselves, because they can actually enact change if there's something goes wrong.
Yeah, just imagine this guy living in his basement with a Raspberry Pi, thinking that he's contributing to the mining of Bitcoin, and then going to one of these mining farms that's worth however many billions and saying, "Look, no, actually this transaction wasn't valid. Can you please update that?" They're no way. I mean, the whole question is though, and actually this brings me on to the next point, is that when people think, this is another kind of misunderstanding, I think, is when people think decentralized, and this kind of applies to DAOs as well. It's they tend to think of anti-government and outside the realms of regulation. And this is not true, especially with, say, maybe proof of work systems and maybe other systems similar, where you have quite public facing entities. Like to be a big actual contributing miner to BTC, you've got to have a huge mining setup, right? And to have a setup that's that big, you have to also have like be probably quite a public facing, easily identifiable body. And with that kind of thing, like you should also be held to like legal account, right? And I think there's a lot, this is misunderstanding. Decentralized means that no one's held accountable. It's distributed amongst all the people. But if we're saying these miners are big entities that are actually running the show, it's far more centralized than we think, then these miners should be held to account. And it doesn't seem like they are right now in a lot of spaces.
Yeah, I agree. It's a difficult one because, yeah, a lot of them are corporate entities. And I know at least a few miners and mining pools have been, like publicly traded companies. So they have also fiduciary duties to their shareholders and things. So, yeah, I think that's something that will mature actually a lot in the future, is what are the obligations on these entities, the nodes, which are actively maintaining the network, who are creating blocks and who are contributing to the meaningful definition of decentralization that is useful. I mean, this kind of, we've got Emma Pinius in the chat with a really interesting FAQ that often gets leveled, I think, is that can blockchain actually exist without decentralization? I mean, what do you think about that? Do you have a take on it?
I think there are alleged blockchains that do exist that aren't decentralized. Like I could quite easily have 3 separate computers that are either all in my house, that are all separate miners, and say I've got a decentralized network. But even if those 3 computers are 10 times the compute, or say 1,000,000 times the computing power, so we've got some serious hash power. If they're all controlled by an entity like me, then if we're saying decentralization is all about the power dynamic, and I am the power dynamic, and I run all those miners, then it's not properly decentralized, right? And then even if like those computers who are mining are in different countries, but they're still owned by me, that this is not decentralized. And I've seen there's been like a lot of publications looking into how decentralized are a lot of these top cryptocurrency networks and all this kind of stuff. And they've got like 1,000 proper miners. And you're like, but these 1,000 miners are all run by the same company, or subsidiaries of this company. So it seems like, yeah, I think people would describe them as decentralized quite easily, but it's the power dynamic. Actually, it doesn't really make sense if it's not separate individual entities without maybe shared goals that don't work together and interact, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm aware of the kind of reports you're mentioning. Like there was an interesting study published. I think it was actually commissioned by the Pentagon in the US. And they did this report into what is, how decentralized is Bitcoin in practice. And they kind of found that it's maybe not so decentralized. But I think we'll come back to that point after. You mentioned there kind of mining pools and things as well. And that's another dimension to this. So one of the, we've talked about miners as kind of these individuals, like corporate entities so far. And obviously, to take it all the way back to the beginning of Bitcoin, it wouldn't actually have been like that. It was, in the beginning, people in their bedrooms being able to mine because the hash rate was so low, and the difficulty of mining has increased exponentially over time. But now, yeah, it's corporate entities, but you do have this one kind of subcategory of miners, which are called mining pools, right? And these are entities that they effectively aggregate hash power from many different sources. So that's how you as an individual might be involved in Bitcoin mining, is you might contribute your hashing power, your electricity power, to one of these mining pools. But again, you're still not contributing to the power in the system, because the political power or the rule making power, or rule enforcing power, I should say, in the system, because effectively the coordinator, the corporate entity that's kind of making most of the money here, will be defining, okay, what transactions go in that block, which transactions are valid, and just giving a block template that they say is valid to these hashing entities, and say, just hash on that. You don't care what's in that block. Let me worry about that. But yeah.
But a point on that would be like, if I contribute and then all of a sudden I don't like what this party's doing that controls, our mining pool, I can pull out, right? So isn't that like voting with my feet in a way, and say, okay, well, I'm going to move to a different mining pool because I don't agree with this transaction you just mined. I'm not saying that happens, but that is an option, right?
Yeah, and that is a subtlety, right? It's true. If you are pointing your hash rate at one provider, then you can move it to another. But that it is true that you never are an active decision maker. You could go to a different one that is in a kind of collusion or cartel with the one you were with previously, and you still can't make the rules unless you're kind of independently mining blocks. So yeah, it's a difficult one. There are a lot of subtleties involved in Bitcoin decentralization.
And I think one of the other things that we kind of touched on earlier about the anti-government agenda, which I think is kind of inherent with this term. Like when people think of decentralization, they think of like the biggest central authorities, which, in a lot of ways are governments and all this kind of stuff. And I think that they kind of see cryptocurrencies and all the things around decentralization as a means to remove trusted intermediaries. And I think that is it's impossible in my mind still. Like, sure, we can interact in a peer-to-peer fashion for very small transactions because there's not much skin in the game and all this kind of stuff. And maybe I just need you to give me an address and all this kind of stuff. But for like a lot of interactions we have, we're always going to need a trusted intermediary to facilitate that. Like if I don't know you are Jack Davies and you've been given this, passport by the UK government, or you've got this bank account that I can send money to and all this kind of stuff, it's really difficult for us to interact. And the only way to facilitate that kind of peer-to-peer interaction, especially like when we go talking about larger transactions and more important day-to-day usage, we do need some kind of intermediary or certificate of authority to initiate that trust. I think one of the things that I want to emphasize around decentralization is it's not a complete removal of all intermediaries and definitely not of all trusted parties. It's a kind of a push from the complete reliance of those trusted intermediaries in every single step to an initial trusted step. And then we push the trust from them to the technology itself. So they propagate the trust initially and give us the tools to trust one another. But then we push our interactions and the trusted interactions onto the technology itself.
Yeah, I kind of would go. I really like the way you described that, and I kind of go one further. I do know the white paper quite well, and it talks about removing unnecessary intermediaries, right? So it's not saying that third parties and intermediaries aren't important. I think it's actually much more the nature of those third parties, and the ones that we don't want are the kind of the rent-seeking, you would say, third parties that basically capture the market, like your Mastercards, Visas, because essentially, if you compare Visa, Mastercard as a payment system or payments network, and then you compare that with something like Bitcoin, you've essentially got a network in something like Visa, which is a central point of failure, and it's non-competitive. So once you're using that, there's no competition. They're just taking a fee on your transaction and kind of a percentage fee. And in Bitcoin, what you have is you never actually submit to a single provider. So when you're paying, a card payment, you're kind of choosing a provider, Mastercard, Visa, WorldPay, or whatever. You're picking a provider and you're saying you have my transaction, and they say great, and because you're our customer, we'll charge you whatever we want, and that's fine. What you're doing in Bitcoin is you're submitting it to a network of potential providers. So you don't actually pick your provider up front, and that's the key: is that it's always competitive. So all the nodes, all the miners are constantly competing for your fee that you're offering, basically. So that's why it's more robust in it, and why decentralization kind of matters is because the decentralization is an emergent property of Bitcoin because it's competitive, in my opinion. So because if they're always competing for your fees, then you're going to have different parties.
And this brings us on to another interesting point. So on the competition, this makes sense to me for proof of work. Does this also apply for proof of stake, which is the new kind of consensus mechanism? When we talk about consensus mechanisms, we did have an episode on blockchain. We touched on it lightly, but it's effectively, if we have these, say, 3 different miners who all own their own Excel file, which is the ledger. The thing with blockchains typically is you can't remove any of the previous kind of the previous fields or things basically in the Excel file. You can only append. So the trick is, if I have 3 different Excel files in 3 different locations run by 3 different people, how do we achieve consensus when we append new entries to those Excel files. And there's different ways of doing that. The leading one, which was demonstrated by Bitcoin, was proof of work. It kind of referenced there by Jack, competition to basically get there by increasing, the amount of work we do to basically choose this random number. But there's this new consensus mechanism, which is kind of taking a lot of headlines right now, which is less energy efficient, which is called proof of stake. Does that still add the aspect you were talking about, or have the aspect you were talking about with competition?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think, yes, it still has that competitive nature, because in both proof of work and proof of stake, essentially you have each block is going to be mined by someone who's kind of selected at random, let's say, but it's not like a uniform distribution. Like you basically buy more lottery tickets, and the more lottery tickets you have, the more likely you are to mine the block. And in proof of work, the lottery tickets you're buying correspond to your hashing power, the amount of energy you're expending, the amount of machines you've got to hash. In proof of stake, the number of tickets you have corresponds to how much money you've put down in the system, how much money you've staked. That's where the term comes from. And so the competitive element is there. But what I think is the fundamental difference is that in proof of work, it kind of acts as a de-anonymization, or a way of identifying who the participants are. So that there isn't a central point of failure, because okay, there are 3 or 4 big corporate entities, some of them all registered companies. As I said, one of them could be a publicly listed company. And the reason for that is it's very hard to hide if you have a massive mining operation. I mean, the size of these things is huge. There's one in El Salvador being powered by geothermal energy from a volcano. They're huge operations. Whereas in proof of stake, it's much easier to hide wealth, because it's just money. It's an account-based system. So, you have multiple different addresses with money associated with them that are doing most of the voting on new blocks. But how do we know they're not all controlled by the same person or some conglomerate? And maybe that is a central point of failure, that it's not as easy to tell that there isn't one, basically.
Yeah, and when we're saying that one of the issues right now with like this whole decentralization, DAOs and all this kind of stuff, is that a lot of these organizations that are effectively running these huge businesses that a lot of people are dependent on, they're not they don't seem like they're properly regulated. They don't seem like they come under the same laws that you and I come under, Jack. And I hope that it seems like governments are starting to catch up with this, and are starting to actually push through legislation onto these companies to say, no, if you're operating in our country, you are beholden to our laws. And like you say, if it's a very publicly visible company with big mining operations, for example, then it's much easier to get them under the thumb, basically, and start to regulate these people properly and make sure we don't have all these Ponzi schemes and miners dropping off the face of the earth and loads of money being stolen and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a nice segue that you're mentioning regulation, because in 2022, there was quite a nice definition, I think, of decentralization introduced by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in America. And this kind of backs up the definition I think we both subscribe to. So I'll read it out for you. So this was from Commissioner of the SEC, Hester Pierce, in 2020. So they said, decentralization essentially means it's not controlled and is not reasonably likely to be controlled or unilaterally changed by any single person, group of persons, or entities under common control. So I think that's a really nice, concise way of saying it, and it captures that point about is it reasonably likely to be controlled by a single entity or group. And that's why proof of stake, I think, it's harder to say it's unlikely to be controlled by some person.
And I think this whole idea of like control and controlling protocols kind of reminds me a lot of like going back more high level, the Web 1 to Web 2 to Web 3. Like early days of Web 1, it was all open source. We saw lots of like individual small startups just spinning out companies as left, right, and center, and things were advancing very quickly. And then Web 2, these centralized parties all of a sudden started to dominate, the Googles, the Microsofts, whatever it was. And they started to develop like their own internal protocols, private protocols potentially. And they got all the users coming on. So all of a sudden it was quite difficult for people to say, develop on these protocols. Not difficult, but they had to go through the companies, right? And there's this whole thing that I've seen with like central companies when they have like good developers or good projects built on top of them, they bring them in because obviously they want the users that come from that, and then they turn into competitors, and they'll start to try and like replicate their product and actually make it better, or they'll change the protocol and go in a different direction. And there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that. And I think one of the things that I see from Web3, and if we think of like saying, I don't know, Bitcoin becoming the plumbing of the next internet, it's like I've seen that in a lot of places. I think one of the things that we need to see in Web3 is open protocols, fixed open protocols that anyone can build on in a transparent way. And I know that decentralization doesn't necessarily mean that, but I think it's something that we do need to see.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's really good to make the comparison out between Web 2 and Web 3, because all those central companies have centralized control of the internet in a way, right? We go to a single company like Google for access to information. We go to a single company for our posting photos on Instagram and stuff. And you see when this goes wrong, like I remember when Facebook went down and when Twitter goes down, everyone goes crazy. And that's why there's this big push to Web3 based social media models, where it's kind of this federated idea. You don't have one company in control. It's a protocol based social media, so that different people can provide the data, and there's not one company that's centralizing control of access to that data, basically. So yeah, it's a good comparison to make.
Yeah, and you see, like, it must be hard. Like, what was the whole Twitter thing? There was loads of companies that were built on feeds directly from Twitter and taking data from Twitter, and then Twitter all of a sudden just changed their entire protocol, and it was like hundreds of millions worth of like companies were not companies, and value of companies were lost because all of a sudden they couldn't work on Twitter anymore. It's like their entire business model is gone. Same with Amazon. Like, people build, it's a bit slightly different comparison, but people will develop a product on Amazon. Amazon will take it, make it way cheaper, put it to the top of the search list, and then just steal it, and it's there. It's like it's hard. It must be hard for developers. It must like stifle innovation to have to go through these quite closed barriers that are controlled by single central entities. And I'm hoping that this whole decentralization agenda, even though it's not directly that, it helps that with especially on the protocol level.
Yeah, you're right. It's like it can really disrupt the business models of people who use these use Web 2 kind of business models, because if Facebook changed their advertising algorithm, as has happened many times, then this can affect everyone that's using it in a really detrimental way. I feel like I want to talk a bit about we've alluded to maybe the lack of decentralization in Bitcoin, but I want to go into some specifics about how decentralized are these blockchains in practice, because there are some interesting historical things that we've seen, right? And even if you just go looking today, right, I had a quick look on the kind of the mining distribution in Bitcoin. So
that's your classic
today,
morning read, right?
Yeah, I get it. Before I do anything else in the morning, I've got to check the mining stats. So as of today, 2 miners in BTC control more than 50% of the hash rate. So are the decision makers on more than 50% of blocks. And if you go to just 7 miners, that's 95%, right? And this comes back to something we didn't mention, is decentralization is a spectrum, right? So we said it means no central point of failure. So that means anything basically more than 2 or 3, basically. It can be 3 nodes in the system. That means there's no single point of failure. It could be 1,000 nodes, and it's a spectrum. People will say, how decentralized is it, based on where along that spectrum you fall.
And what are the benefits of saying, okay, so if you've got 3 completely separate entities that are all mining, right? We'll say that there's it's a very small chance that all 3 of them can go down, or 2 out of the 3 of them can collude, right? So that for all intents and purposes, they are separate, 3 separate miners. Is there any benefit in having 5 miners? Now, what is the benefit of having like an increasing decentralization after the point at which we say it's decentralized enough that we don't think there's a single point of failure?
Yeah, it's an age-old question. I don't have the answer to this. I think it's something that will kind of naturally be borne out. What are people comfortable with will determine confidence in the system, and therefore how many nodes there are. I mean, I especially as Bitcoin scales, I think your nodes are just going to get bigger and bigger. They'll move from big corporate entities to unicorn size corporate entities, and maybe I think in the future there'll be government entities will be mining. I mean, maybe in the future it's just governments when it gets that big. So I think there's definitely an advantage to not necessarily just purely the number of nodes, up to a certain point, but where they're located, what legal jurisdictions they're in, I can definitely see it being a good thing to have one or two in each continent of the world, for example, because then it's very hard to imagine a scenario where all of them are compromised at once.
Yeah, and this becomes so hard when we're talking about like DAOs and them operating outside of like legal systems. And the fact is, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, they are global systems, but they're run by miners in certain jurisdictions. Imagine if, you know, I'm in sub-Saharan Africa and all of a sudden Bitcoin's like the people that run Bitcoin, say all the miners are in America. I don't think they are in America. They're a bit more, you know, distributed than that. They all of a sudden say, okay, you're not allowed to have this transaction because we don't agree with the merchant that you're sending to, or something like this. Like, how is that going to work? Like, how do we have like global regulation for mining systems that are in certain jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's again, you give me all the tough questions now. My view on it is kind of that have this concept of net neutrality and service providers like ISPs being kind of not held responsible for the traffic that goes through them necessarily because they're not the originators. I think a similar model can apply in Bitcoin, because you could say, well, because nodes aren't looking at your transactions and saying, oh, who's sending to who here? Because again, it's very hard to tell in most cases. Or data transactions, they're not saying, oh, I don't like this application, I'm not going to mine their transactions. They're just purely looking at how profitable is it to mine this transaction. So I think some kind of similar neutrality policy could apply to them, but beyond that, it's difficult.
You're right. It's the exchanges that do that typically, right? It's the exchanges that come under the cosh because they know where money's actually being transferred. It's like it's not anonymous with them because they do KYC on your identities, and a lot of the AML that happens, and when people's accounts get frozen, it goes through exchanges. But the same questions kind of apply. Like Coinbase is obviously a global operator with people all over the world using it, but it's partially based in the US, and a lot of like the freezing, account freezing, all this kind of stuff is pushed on them by the regulators in the US. And it's a tricky one for kind of international systems to kind of be regulated in certain jurisdictions for the globe.
Yeah, and if Bitcoin is that successful, or any blockchain is that successful, that it is, getting massive, maybe even nation state actors as nodes, it's kind of in your interest to keep the barrier to doing that low, not from a hash power sense, but from a legal one. You want to limit the number of failure cases for why you might not be able to do something as a node, why you might not be able to continue operations. And just as an example of why you need multiple jurisdictions is because a huge amount of the mining was previously in China, and then they had this ban that kind of just completely destroyed it. I can't even remember if they lifted the ban. I think they might have, but for a number of years it was. Another thing we should touch on about decentralization is that it's not a static thing. It changes over time. And there's no more obvious way to think about that than, think about the origin of Bitcoin. You would have had just one guy. It was a centralized system for all intents and purposes for the first however long, on day dot, you had effectively one miner, and for various periods from 2009 to 2012, who knows if it was just one miner at various times in that, So people are happy. Bitcoin survived despite being heavily centralized in the past. And now we've kind of hit this kind of maybe a happy medium of, say, 3 to 10 nodes that are typically mining everything.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of reminds me of the Ethereum DAO hack, like the giant fork that we talked about in the blockchain episode. Like that was a very centralized decision, right? I think a lot of people, I'm not sure whether I agree or not, but a lot of people say that it was Vitalik's friends who are people that supported him that lost a lot of this money. So it was in his best interest to, make sure that the money was returned to them. And because he had like a good control over the miners at that stage, he was able to take most of Ethereum's network in the direction he wanted, which was actually to take the money back, right?
Yeah. Do you remember the details of that one, about why that happened? Because I think it'd be good to just recap very, very briefly.
Yeah. So my understanding is there was this decentralized autonomous organization that had a fund, and they had a smart contract that was basically getting lots of money onto the Ethereum network. And some guy in the smart contract found a hack where he could basically take all the money. It was like, what was it, like 60 million, or is it 60 million, 100 million? I think it's worth like billions.
I think it was 60
now. Yeah. And obviously at the time, they're like, well, a lot of the developers in the community were like, well, you shouldn't have manhandled the smart contract in the first place. And this is immutability manifest. Like, you've lost the money because of a mistake you made, and now it's been transferred to this address that we can all see, and well, screw you. But obviously the fund itself was an example for Vitalik about how all these things could be used and what the future looked like. And I think he had some friends that were actually involved in the DARE fund as well. That was what some of the conspiracies were. So he was like, no, I am going to make sure all the miners will return the funds, which is basically for them just on the ledger. They can just say input over here, push that input over here, and we can manually get around all this stuff. And this split the community. I think Vitalik took like 80% of the network with him, which was Ethereum as we know it today. And then the 20% who were like, no, this is not the principles of blockchain. This is not how it's meant to work. We're meant to stick with immutability. They forked off or went to Ethereum Classic and carried on. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I think that tallies with my memory as well. And this led to a big chain split between Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, and only one of them really survived. But it goes back to that definition of Commissioner Pierce, right? This was a case clearly of some kind of effectively a cartel of developers and miners who decided amongst themselves, we want to change, we want to roll back, right? They call these rollbacks, and in Bitcoin, people. This is really, this goes against all the sacred decentralization properties of Bitcoin to roll something back as a unanimous decision. But even in Bitcoin, we've got historical precedent for this, right? So in 2013, there was a very similar situation where there was this accidental chain split because there was a network upgrade. There was an incompatibility between the old version of the software, the new version. And people didn't like that, and they said, well, let's just roll it back. And they did, so Bitcoin, we said it's immutable decentralized ledger, was rolled back and completely reversed the state of the ledger. And people go, okay, well, that was 2013, that was in the old days when it was just a few people. But as recently as 2019, so when I was actually working in the space, you may not recall this one, but there was a hack of Binance, right? So basically the biggest exchange in the world right now. They were hacked for $40 million, and they essentially started exploring the option of rolling back the Bitcoin blockchain. So the CEO, Changpeng Zhao, started talking about this on Twitter, and everyone lost their minds, and they didn't do it in the end. But it shows you that there is a little bit of a weakness to this decentralization when you start thinking about which actors, like the exchanges, are well funded, well motivated to try and influence the system.
Yeah, well, I think they're known as a bit of a pirate exchange, right? But it just goes to show that, miners, they do control the network. We talk about it as decentralized, but they are effectively the network administrators. They can, with sufficient power, if they have like over 50% of the mining power, they can do whatever they want in the network, and they should be held accountable for the things they do, right? But yeah, so we've talked a little bit about what decentralization is. Shall we talk about whether it's good or bad? Talk about some of the positives and the negatives of the term generally, and maybe the specifics within that.
Sure. So I think maybe I can start with saying I think overall it's a good thing because fundamentally, as I said, I think it's an emergent property of how Bitcoin works. So it's good because it's a result of a functioning blockchain, a functioning digital cash system. So if you have a blockchain that's decentralized, it's probably operating correctly, right? And again, it's a better trust model for implementing a distributed non-fiat based currency or money, I think.
Yeah, I think I think my definition from the network side, which you said is distribution rather than decentralization, but I suppose they kind of apply it in both scenarios, is resilience. Like the fact that we get such great network resilience from Bitcoin in a way because it's distributed across multiple computers, but in another way because it's decentralized across different entities in different places as well, means there's never been a network failure to my mind of Bitcoin, which is impressive, right? For however long it's been going, there's never been a network failure. I think that's obviously a massive positive. One of the other things is, like we talked about earlier, is the opening things up. I think it's not inherent in decentralized networks as a whole, but it's part of the conversation of having these fixed protocols that aren't controlled by single central entities with their own agendas. means that people can comfortably develop on it, know that things aren't going to change too radically, because the network administrators, their incentive is to just maintain the network, is to get the token, because they get tokens, they're rewarded with tokens for actually maintaining the network, right? So what they want is people to be happy with the network, people to be coming to the network to use those tokens and to up the value of those tokens. So I think the separation of the motivations is quite important. And I think that enables the open protocols and the Web3 vision that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, for me, it's not so much the decentralization itself, right? I don't think it's the end. It's the things that cause it to be decentralized that are really good. So, the incentive mechanism, as you said, the fact that it's open, permissionless, so anyone can join and compete. You could always have a new player join the network and compete, and the fact that it is always competitive is a very, very good thing. Because miners who offer a poor service, who don't, process as many transactions, who are slower, they get punished directly, because they call it like a red queen game, like you're always running one of these infinite games, running on the treadmill forever. Only the fittest survive, and you have to maintain. It's not like you can just, like you see with the Mastercard or Visa, you work hard to gain a position of superiority in the market, but then once you get there, you have this kind of closed network with sticky customers.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't have that in Bitcoin. You always have to keep working, which is, I think, a fundamentally very good thing. What about the bad? What do you think is a bad consequence of decentralization?
I think some of the things aren't with decentralization itself. Like, my thing is around like people's understanding of decentralization. It's like, it's not like Bitcoin's not going to take down governments. Like, we're not going to never need central entities or trusted certificate authorities and all this. And there'll be no regulation and anarchy and all this kind of stuff. Like, that annoys me about the space, to be honest. I think we're always going to need that. Like, in the best case scenario, Bitcoin will work alongside governments, right? And it will actually enable governments. Like, there needs to be an identity solution that is, built in or works with Bitcoin to actually take it to its full potential. And I think people need to understand that decentralized systems still need to operate within the law, and that is complex. I think that's another bad side, is that Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the biggest, kind of decentralized networks in the world, they're global. They're all over the world, but they need to be regulated. And I think we really do need to see a global effort to regulate them consistently across the board. Otherwise, all the miners, will just move to one place where there's no laws, but people will still be able to use it, right? And that kind of is a disadvantage of the system, I'd say.
Yeah, and where do you sit on regulation right now? Like, do you think that miners should be directly regulated, or do you think it's kind of the systems, the coins themselves need regulation, or is it a combination of both?
I think it is a combination of both. I think I have stronger opinions on the miners. I think miners do need to be regulated, and one of the reasons I think it's positive for them to be regulated, I think if the US government gives a network or a miner the seal of approval and says, you know what, we've actually done our due diligence here, and Bitcoin miners said they're going to comply, US citizens start using Bitcoin, like, that's going to be a boon for them, right? Loads of people are going to jump onto the network and feel confident and comfortable interacting. That's the one thing I think will help adoption. But we also need to make sure that they do comply with laws. Like, right, we can't have these, like, I think in two ways. One, it will get rid of all these pirate networks and these Ponzi schemes and these cryptos that spin out of nowhere. If you suddenly have a seal of approval say these are the safe ones, these are not the safe ones. I think that is going to be a big boom for the industry once regulation starts to catch up with the technology and both coins and miners are regulated. What do you think about regulation, Jack? It's a big topic.
Yeah, and also I think I agree with everything you said. I think also an aspect that is not being discussed whatsoever, and definitely needs to be for all the utility applications, the data applications we talked about, is what obligations do miners have about the data on the blockchain itself. Because we've had cases in the past of illegal data being stored on the blockchain, and who's responsible? Should it be redacted? The right to privacy and GDPR, right to be forgotten if some data is leaked on the blockchain, and then there's a super injunction to get rid of it. Then how do you do that? And I think it's not like a technical problem. It's more there's not regulatory clarity on what the role of nodes is there. But I think that will come. And I think regulation, as we always say, is inevitable. Just a final thought for me on kind of the negatives. I think you've alluded to it already with the DAOs, but I think decentralization is often used as a byword for kind of a lack of accountability, actually. So people think, well, decentralized is just we're all in this together, we're in a herd mentality. Therefore, when you don't have someone accountable, no one is, right? Which is very much not the case, I don't think. And I often think about this with smart contracts on Ethereum and people who create DeFi, decentralized finance. Can't believe we haven't brought up that term. Maybe another time. I think DeFi is a whole episode in itself. But decentralized finance, sure, it might be decentralized in how it operates. You put the contract on the blockchain and then anyone can use it, open, permissionless, whatever. But somebody has to write the contract in the first place, right? And should they be responsible for how that works? And if they attract people to use it, and then there's a security flaw, as we've seen time and time again with these hacks, who's responsible and how responsible should they be? Especially if it's been created by multiple different people and open source developers and things. And people often just shrug it off, I think, at the minute while regulation's catching up and say, well, it's decentralized, therefore no one's responsible. But I don't think it can operate like that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think like a lot of the laws we have do apply. It's just kind of retrofitting them, and the education needs to be there for people to understand that someone is always accountable for something. Someone's the one that pushes the button. Someone's the one that signs the contract. So on that note, what do you think the future looks like for decentralization?
Yeah, I think I think the main question about it for me, again, if we regulation aside and all those points, is what you mentioned earlier. Like, what is the optimal level on this spectrum of decentralization? I think it's really, really interesting to see where that goes. So I think the most interesting thing that will happen in the future, beyond the regulatory clarity and what happens there, is just seeing, where Bitcoin and other blockchains land. What is the golden number? So maybe not the most exciting point, but I think it'll be interesting to watch. What about you?
I think for me, it's around, I think, like we said, in decentralized network, there's a tendency to have more transparency, more open protocols. And I hope that's the case. I hope that we start to see, lots of communities building on, decentralized networks like Bitcoin, for example, as a protocol layer. That would really excite me. And I think the other thing is the education side. Like you said, people need to understand that decentralized doesn't mean you're outside the law, and you have to be held accountable. And I'm hoping regulation catches up. I'm hoping that legal enforcement catches up, just because it's going to mean that these systems are adopted by the biggest players in the world once the regulation catches up. I'm going to see lots of people, real world applications being built on top of them. And that really excites me.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the SEC and the Pentagon taking a stance on decentralization is really positive. I think that's a great thing moving us forward. Okay, so I think that is probably a good place to end. We've covered lots of ground there on decentralization, and for what can be a controversial topic, I think it was it was pretty good actually. Maybe we didn't have too much to disagree on. Certainly less so than maybe on the crypto episode. But yeah, with that said, thank you at home for listening wherever you may be, and we'll see you next time to untangle a little more of Web3.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.